Hi, everybody, and welcome back. So in our first two presentations about the elements of poetry, we looked at some of the things that make poetry different from short fiction and drama. And then we talked about some of the literary elements that are in poems that aren't necessarily in those other two genres. So today what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about types of poetry, not all of the types of poetry. You'll see many listed in this little speech bubble here, but we'll be talking about a few common types and traditional forms, many of which are in your book, and some of which we'll be looking at this term for some of your assignments. So then after that, we will be discussing some figurative language, and then what we're going to do is come back to Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost, the poem that we looked at in our first two lectures, and we'll put all the elements together and talk about theme and message. So let's get started. The first type of poem I want to talk about is a lyric. A lyric is a short poem, usually written in the first person point of view. Now, you'll notice that if you're one of the many music majors at our school, you think of lyrics quite differently, right? They're the words that go to a song. Well, actually, a lyric in this sense, this type of poem, expresses an emotion or idea or describes a scene. It usually does not tell a story, but it is often musical in sound, and a lot of these poems were made into songs or put to music. So it is, as much of poetry and literature, music and art and literature often interrelated. And I hope you can see some of those similarities here in poetry, and comparing it to music, just like we looked at some artwork from the previous times when we looked at what was going on with short fiction. So a lyric, unlike some of the other forms that we're going to be looking at in a moment, a lyric does not have a set structure. And when I say short, it can be a page or two long, but not always. Sometimes you'll have lyric poems that are one stanza or two or three. So as an example, Nobody Told Me. This is a short lyric poem that I found that is written by an anonymous author. And I know it's kind of blurry, so you kind of have to bear with me here. Nobody told me. Somewhere along the way, I got the notion that adulthood comes automatically with the passing of years, and that if I would just be good enough, life would be easy. Nobody told me growing up would be so hard. So one of the reasons I picked this poem is because it is pretty straightforward, right? It's not putting the idea of adulthood into, rich symbolism and imagery. It's just saying, through the passing of the years, I thought that adulthood would just sort of come upon me, but growing up is actually difficult and it comes with struggles, right? That's basically it. You'll notice that we've got 5 lines in each stanza. This poem is 2 stanzas long. There's no rhyme. It's in free verse. There's no set rhythm either. And it's broken up from 3 sentences. So structurally, that's how it's set up. Again, you can have another poem that is in a specific rhythm with rhyme, and maybe only 4 lines long, and it would still be a lyric. So we'll find some of these as we go through our course. We're going to look at a couple that are of varying lengths and with different subjects. Here, the idea is just about growing up, right? Other times you might have poems, a lot of love poetry, you will find in lyric form. They'll express an emotion like melancholy or loneliness or maybe even joy, or they describe a scene. Lyric poems can use imagery and symbolism. It's just that the one that I showed you doesn't. So let's take a look at another form. The Shakespearean sonnet is also called an Elizabethan sonnet. Queen Elizabeth was the ruler in England who was in charge, so to speak, at least for the first part of Shakespeare's life before King Jacob. And many other poets wrote in this very rigid structure. It's just that we know and we have existing a lot of Shakespeare's works. So a lot of people have looked at his plays, but not his poetry. But there are many poems that he wrote, and most of them, not all, but most of them are in the form of sonnets. So we have other writers from the same period, and therefore it can take on either name, either the queen's name or the poet's name. These types of sonnets are 14-line poems with a very specific rhyme scheme. The poem is 3 quatrains. Now, if you don't remember what that means, you can take a look at the notes from our first section. But basically, quatrains means that they are 4 lines. 4 lines long and ends with a couplet. Now, the interesting thing here is that most sonnets are not broken up into separate stanzas. So they have these 3 quatrains, 12 lines total, and then the rhyming couplet, all within one stanza. Typically. Other times you will see it broken up with the 3 quatrains and then the couplet separately, but for the most part I haven't found that. The rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then that rhyming couplet, G, G, there at the end. So, here is an example. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often in his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So here we have the author writing this poem, and we're going to talk about the speaker of this poem separately. You remember that the speaker is kind of a persona that the author takes to convey the message in the poem, almost like a narrator in a short story. So, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? You are, to put it in plain terms, you are more lovely and more temperate than a summer's day. You're lovelier than the wonderful warm days of summer. Rough winds shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. So rough winds come up and summer ends too quickly. Sometimes the hot eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. So sometimes the sun shines bright, and other times it is dimmed. But when summer ends, but your eternal summer, the summer of your, if we think about life in seasons, when we're in spring, we're quite young. When we're summer, we come into full blossom. When we're autumn, we become more mature. And when we're in our winter years, when the white hairs grow upon our head, we come into a time of fading and growing older, right? So this is someone who is in that summertime, and he is telling her, the speaker says to her, you will be in this beautiful blossoming summer state forever, because even when death takes you and brags that you wander in his shade, these eternal lines, this poem, will have you continuing to grow. So as long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this poem, and this poem gives life to thee, to you. So basically he's saying, I want to immortalize you in poetry form, so that not only will I know of your great, wonderful, lovely, temperate beauty, but other people will as well, long after you're gone. And the speaker is Correct. This was written hundreds of years ago, and yet people still read it. So that's sort of what the poem means. I don't like to just read this one and not kind of explain. But we can see here, day, temperate, May, date. Now remember that I'm reading this with an American accent and certainly not an Elizabethan accent from Britain. Shines, dimmed, declines, untrimmed, fade, oast, great, shade, growest, and then see. And so if you remember I know this is kind of messy because I'm trying to write with a mouse, but if you remember when we change a word when we're looking at rhyme scheme, then we give it a new letter. But you can see how this follows that pattern. So narrative poems, we're going to be looking at the Goblin Market later on in this term. And the Goblin Market is a longer narrative poem. Not quite an epic, so it's not the length of an epic poem necessarily, but it's a longer narrative poem. Narrative poems tell a story. We looked at narratives when we looked at short fiction, and now we're going to look at some narrative poetry as well. They're longer than a lyric because the poet needs to establish characters and a plot. We're also going to look at some other narrative poetry, which there are lectures for. The Goblin Market there is a lecture for, but there's also one on Richard Cory. There's another one on My Last Duchess. So if I've assigned those to you to read this semester, I change poems every semester. But if you have those are all narrative poems. There's some kind of a character and there's some kind of a plot. Paul Revere's Ride and the Highwayman are other examples. And as I said, we're going to be looking at Goblin Market. So basically, in a narrative, there is just some kind of a story being told, and yet there are the other poetic elements. So things like figurative language and rhythm and rhyme that there wouldn't be in a story. And it's a lot of the times more interesting to read. With some of the narrative poems that we're going to be looking at, I'm going to kind of give you an overview of what the story is, so you're not kind of searching and hunting around for that plot line, and you can focus on some things like imagery and symbolism and metaphor and all of those types of things. Epic poems are longer than narratives. They're a lengthy narrative poem about heroic events, oftentimes deeds, events significant to the culture or nation. That's sort of like the textbook definition there. The Epic of Gilgamesh is an example of one. And here is a little taste of the Epic of Gilgamesh. He who has seen everything, I will make known to the lands. I will teach him who experienced all things alike. Anu granted him the totality of knowledge of all. He saw the secret, discovered the hidden. He brought information of the time before the flood. He went on a distant journey, pushing himself to exhaustion, but then was brought to peace. You can see here in the Epic of Gilgamesh exactly what they're talking about over on the left, right? They're heroic deeds, and this is from the introduction of the poem, or the first part of the poem at least. So the poet is saying, the speaker is saying, he who has seen everything, Gilgamesh, I will make him known. I will teach about him. Our God granted him the totality of knowledge, so he has all the knowledge. He has information from before the flood. He was pushed to exhaustion and brought to peace. And it goes on from there. The heroic deeds and events of this fictional character and his story is in this epic. Other epics are things like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, these long books. Many times they came from oral traditions and then were written down. So it's some interesting history. And honestly, I wish that we had time to read an epic poem, but this class moves pretty quickly. But if you take an actual poetry class, or you take if you take mythology at some point, you might have the wonderful experience of learning about some of this epic poetry. A ballad also has a the poem came up first. A ballad is a poem that has a specific structure. So it is arranged in quatrains, stanzas of 4 lines. Stopping by the woods on a snowy evening, we talked about its 4 stanzas of 4 lines each, and there are 4 metrical feet in each line. So it could maybe be considered a ballad, but ballads have a little bit more to them than just that. Typically, they have the rhyme scheme A, B, A, B. Now, the one that I have over on the right does not, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit because it is a type of ballad. Ballads are usually a narrative, which again means that they tell a story. So epics and ballads are types of narrative poetry, but you can see they're quite different, right? Epics are book length, and ballads can sometimes be longer, but not always. They are like lyric poetry, musical in sound, and they were often set to music as folk songs. This form continues to be used today in modern music. So if you hear like about rock ballads, sometimes they're in the exact form of a ballad, and sometimes it just means that it's like a little bit slower, kind of a power song, right? This on the right-hand side, I will not sing, but it has been put to music. So, all in the merry month of May, when green leaves they was a-springin', this young man on his deathbed lay for the love of Barbara Allen. He sent his man unto her then to the town where she was dwellin'. You must come to my master, dear, if your name be Barbara Allen. For death is printed in his face and sorrows in him dwellin', and you must come to my master, dear, if your name be Barbara Allen. If death be printed in his face and sorrows in him dwellin', then little better shall he be for bonny Barbara Allen. I hate to give spoiler alerts about a poem that is hundreds of years old, but essentially she sort of spurns his love, but then they both die, and out of his grave grows a rose, and out of hers a briar, and they intertwine. And it's this lovely poem, but you'll notice we have May and Lay, Springin and Allen, sort of. This, I don't know why in this they give the G, but typically it doesn't have that, and you can sort of hear it when I read it. But then here, then and dear don't match up. But we have the repetition of the deer here as well, and we have face and then face. So there is, I don't want to go through it completely because we have other things to get to, but there is a rhyme scheme here, but just not the traditional ballad of A, B, A, B. In other stanzas, then it would be C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, etc. And sort of connected or similar to the 3 quatrains in that sort of same pattern, A, B, A, B, in the sonnet, except the sonnet has the final rhyming couplet, and it's only 14 lines long. There are other types of sonnets too, but that's the most popular one. So haiku we're going to talk about quite a bit more later on, but I just wanted to briefly introduce it here. Originally from a Japanese form of poetry that showed a contrast or juxtaposition between 2 concepts. So I think a lot of times people know that it includes a nature word in there somewhere, but it's really also about this this contrast, showing two different images or 2 different ideas within the same image. Nature is often the subject. If there is no nature word, it's actually a different form of Japanese poetry using the same number of syllables. And again, we'll talk about that more later. In English, a haiku stanza has 17 syllables in a 5-7-5 pattern. So here, worker bees can leave, even drones can fly away. The queen is their slave. This follows that 5-7-5 pattern. It has a nature word, and we have a contrast between the the bees, the drones, and the split kind of comes here, right? And then the queen. That's the contrast between the two images. We'll talk more about haiku and the meaning behind many poems and the imagery used later on. And we'll look at poems that were written during and after the Japanese internment in the United States during World War II, and the poems that came before and after that time. Pastoral poetry is kind of interesting. Here we have a very pastoral or farm-like scene. Oh, it came up all at once. Well, pastoral comes from pastor, the Latin for shepherd. It refers to a literary work dealing with shepherds and rustic life. The Greek and Latin pastoral works go back to the 3rd century. And as seen in the picture here, this is an idealized rather than a realistic view of rustic life. So for example, my husband and I do live on a farm. And we have a garden and we have chickens, and we're kind of trying to expand it bit by bit. At one point, a couple days ago, one of our chickens was taken by a chicken hawk, and we were quite upset about that because they are almost like pets. They're laying hens. And one year our garden died because of a drought. You're not going to get that kind of a view of farm life in a pastoral poem. What you are going to get is the beauty of living in a more rural atmosphere, the calmness, right? All of that kind of thing. The other thing that you get in a lot of these poems are themes of love and seduction. So people who are nice little farm girls like this girl in our picture, and they are seduced by a man from the city, right? Or someone tries to. Anyway, death and mourning, the value of poetry and expressing oneself, the purity of the country versus the corruption of the town. And a lot of times the poem is in the form of a dialogue between two people, which is kind of interesting because it can be a narrative, but it can also just sort of be a dialogue. So this is from, this came out a little bit odd here. The passionate shepherd to his love. Move it over so you guys can see. The Passionate Shepherd to His Love by Christopher Marlowe. This is just a little piece of it. Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove that hills and valleys, dale and field, and all the craggy mountains yield. There will we sit upon the rocks and see the shepherd feed their flocks by shallow rivers to whose falls melodious birds sing madrigals. It's a type of song. This is, again, a dialogue. He's putting on the persona of us, and the speaker becomes the shepherd, right? Christopher Marlowe not. But here... Sorry. Christopher Marlowe was a contemporary of Shakespeare's, and meaning they lived around the same time. And he was the son of shoemakers, so not a shepherd, and he died in a bar fight, so he had quite a tumultuous life. He was murdered at the end of it in a bar, and so I think this is, again, a good example of the speaker and the poet being different, and you can also see this very idealized view of the country, right? The hills and the valleys and the dale and the field and the craggy mountains and the melodious birds singing songs and shallow rivers, and meanwhile they're sitting on the rocks watching the other shepherds feed their sheep and let their sheep roam over the countryside. It's a very peaceful and delightful scene. And that is sort of what pastoral poetry features. So moving on to figurative language. We have a lot of different types listed here. We're going to kind of go through some of them. But the biggest thing, adds color to your writing. And that's basically one of the reasons that poets use it. The other is, again, to build themes and to build their message. An allusion comes from the verb allude, which means refer to. When we get into the Goblin Market, they have very strong Christian allusions, and they refer to the Bible and they refer to Genesis and to the life of Jesus, not directly, but kind of indirectly. So I kind of explain the background of those allusions. When you watch the spoken word poetry, there are a couple poems there that refer or allude to things that are more contemporary. So there's one poem I might have you guys look at by Kanye West, which is he talks about Versace, he talks about Air Jordans, he talks about being the best rapper, and a few other symbols of success, right? So that's basically what allusion that sometimes people will say to something famous, but really it's just something outside the poem. So here is an example from the poem Snowbound. A tunnel walled and overlaid with dazzling crystal. We had read of rare Aladdin's wondrous cave, and to our own his name we gave. So this is people coming upon a cave, and it looks as if it's overlaid by crystal because it's in the snow. And they're referencing Aladdin, and his wondrous cave where he finds the genie's lamp in that story and the movie, but originally in Arabian Nights. So it's an allusion to Aladdin. It's an allusion to his cave. It's an allusion to his to the story 1001 Nights. Oh, and there he is. There's Aladdin in his cave from the film version. A simile is a comparison using like, as, or resembles. So she is as beautiful as a sunset. Usually people remember what similes are. I think they're pretty easy to identify. Metaphors are a little bit more challenging because they're direct comparison of two unalike things. So all the world is a stage. We're merely the players. Having that direct comparison of the world being a stage and people being actors on the stage, right? Acting out their lives. What we talked about metaphor before with short fiction and things like extended metaphor and that kind of thing. Oh, nope, sorry. Here's extended metaphor. Extended metaphor is a metaphor that goes on for several lines or possibly the entire length of the work. Again, we did talk about similes and metaphors in short fiction, but an extended metaphor, sometimes you'll have a poem that is entirely a metaphor. There's another spoken word poem. Again, I might have you guys look at this one, and we might just, I might just put it in a folder for you to watch if you want, called Explaining Depression to My Mother. And she goes through a number of similes and metaphors. Sometimes depression is the bear, meaning that it's, big and growling and overpowering. Sometimes depression is like being at a party that I don't want to be at. Sometimes anxiety is the cousin that depression brings to the party. That's a direct comparison. So when you have one thing is another, that's a metaphor. When you have like or as, it's a simile. An implied metaphor can be even more difficult to detect because the comparison is hinted at but never clearly stated. So for instance, if someone thinks that they are as exciting and interesting and hot as a fire, which I just used a simile, but if they're trying to compare themselves to a fire, instead of saying, I am a fire, I am hot and burning, right? They won't say that. They'll say something like, I crackle with anticipation and my heat licks up your face, right? Like flames, but never using the word flame, never using the word fire. We'll talk about where some of these are in some of our other poems as well. Oh, there it is. Iceberg. The thing with metaphor is you want to look beneath the surface. What is the full representation and what's the symbolism there? Hyperbole is another figure of speech. It's exaggeration, often used for emphasis. Hyperbole is, without a doubt, the single greatest thing in the history of the universe. over exaggerating there. There's another thing, do I have it on here? No, I don't. When you have litotes, Litotes, and that is not exaggerating things for emphasis, so de-emphasizing them to kind of bring attention to them, kind of like a humble brag in a way. But we're going to, when you have, a lot of times when you have epic poetry, you notice the thing from that I read to you from the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a little bit hyperbole there, right? Because he's trying to show you how heroic this guy is, so he's exaggerating things a tiny bit for emphasis. Personification is attributing human characteristics to non-human things. Sometimes people will use the word anthropomorphism, if you've ever heard that term. There's a little bit of a difference between personification and anthropomorphism. So personification is the act of giving human characteristics to animals or objects to create imagery. Anthropomorphism aims to make an animal or object behave and appear like it is a human being. So here we have from Beauty and the Beast, right? Different objects that have appear like people. That's quite different than personification. Personification usually happens in poetry. Children's books often contain anthropomorphism. So this is from Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, which we looked at last time. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. So here we have... Let me change color so you can see this a little bit better. You have the speaker, thinking about what the horse might be thinking. And when he shakes the harness bells, which is something that horses do, it's as if he's asking if there is a mistake, that they're stopped, right? So that is a little bit of light personification. The horse kind of is acting a little bit or has some human characteristics, thinking and asking in a way. But it's very clear here that that's not actually happening, right? The horse isn't turning around, and it isn't anthropomorphized and turning around and saying, "Oh, hey, Wilbur, can we go home now?" That's not what's happening there, right? Symbolism. A symbol works in two ways. First, it's something itself, and it also suggests something deeper. That's what a symbol is. We talked about that again also in short fiction. But it's important to distinguish a symbol from a metaphor. Metaphors are comparisons, whereas symbols associate two things, but their meaning is literal and figurative. Dark cloud is a good example of this. A dark cloud hangs above me. It stays there all day long. It comes every September and stays till June is gone. At times it stops for sunbreaks that just aren't long enough, and so I wait for summer. It's free of such dark stuff. So here, the dark cloud symbolizing school and possibly depression a little bit, the sadness that we feel in our hearts when school is going on as children, and possibly if you're listening to this as an adult and you're nodding along as I'm reading. Imagery. Again, we talked about imagery before too. It's language that appeals to the senses. Most images are visual, many times, but not always. There's a lot of things with sound and touch and taste and smell. What's interesting to me is that really smell is, to me, the most difficult to define. So we don't usually get a whole lot of olfactory imagery. Olfactory is the word for our sense of smell. So we don't get a lot of olfactory imagery in literature. I think it's because those are the things that stir up our memories the most, but they don't really translate to words all that much. But we'll get textures and tastes and what things sound like all the time. So put in your mind the rain that is described below. Oh, this is part of a sonnet from Edna St. Vincent Millay. From a poem by her, rather. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why, I have forgotten, and what arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply. So this is someone who's a little bit older, and she can't really remember all of the loves of her youth, who she kissed and where and why, and who was with her until morning and who might have left early. But the rain is full of ghosts. So this beautiful imagery of ghosts tapping and sighing upon her glass and upon her window. The rain acting that way to remind her of all these loves that she lost. It's beautiful imagery, and I picked it specifically because it's an image dealing with auditory imagery. It's a sound, right? It's not necessarily visual. I think the visual ones are a lot of times more apparent to people and easier to pick out. But what I want you to think of too, like all of them, but especially with imagery, it's easy to identify imagery. It's not as easy to talk about why the author is using that imagery. Here, I think it's kind of clear, right? It's ghosts, and they're tapping and sighing and listening for a reply. Again, a little bit of personification of the rain, right? It is full of ghosts. So there's a metaphor there as well. But why use ghosts? Because we're looking back on the past with possibly a nostalgic remembrance and a pain for what was lost. All right, so I'm going to read this poem one more time, and then we will talk about the meaning, and then you can move on to either watching another video or working on some of the assignments. Stopping by the woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse might think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep. And miles to go before I sleep. Really important to read a poem with taking the pauses where the author has put them and not necessarily at the end of the line so that the rhyme seems forced, right? We talked about that before. We also talked about the rhyme scheme of this poem. It's A, B, it's A, B, A, B, B, C, B, and then it continues that pattern until the end, when all of the words rhyme. Symbolism can be found in the woods, so just, again, to put some of these elements kind of together. There can be symbolism found in the woods, and we're going to talk more about that in the next slide when we get into meaning. But think about what the woods might represent. I said this before, this is not an event that happened. This is the persona the author is putting on. But we think about it like a story. The man is stopping in the woods. It is a very short story, sort of with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what might the woods represent? If we look at it on the surface, this is a man on his way home with a horse and possibly a wagon that has sleigh runners put on it for the winter. He's going home. He stops in the woods. He thinks about how beautiful it is, and he leaves, right? That's sort of what's on the surface, but there can be maybe more there. Imagery, the sensory details. So we get what the woods are like. They're filling up with snow. We get sound imagery, auditory imagery in that third stanza. The harness bells shaking, the sound of the sweep of the wind and the downy flakes of snow coming down. We get the imagery of the visual imagery of the woods, lovely, dark, and deep. It's a snowy evening, the cold and frosty frozen lake. It's the darkest evening of the year. And as I said, the woods are lovely, dark, and deep because they are dark and deep. So perhaps the woods symbolize something more than a forest, and something can be under the surface. Perhaps the speaker's interpretation of the woods lies more within his mind. Is it a peaceful calmness that he is feeling with the hustle and bustle in life, or is it something else? And what is he contemplating, and why does he have to leave? The first interpretation of this poem, and there are many, but there are sort of two common interpretations. Some people believe that the speaker is overwhelmed by nature and has a quiet contemplation about the busyness of life. That's the British spelling there, so I apologize for that. He knows the owner of the woods, but the man is not there to enjoy the quiet because he's in his house, which is in the village, which is perhaps more hectic. The horse thinks it's queer or strange to stop without a horse or a barn nearby, so even the horse is kind of put off by not having civilization near. The horse gives his bells a shake to remind the speaker they should continue on. The speaker is overcome by the beauty of the woods, which are lovely, dark, and deep, and yet he remembers obligations at home and promises to keep, and he is forced to go miles before he can rest. His exhaustion in this thought is emphasized by the last line's repetition. So here we have, I said that about the first line. But this is basically the first interpretation. And what you notice is that we have a claim after interpretation 1, and then the claim is backed up by evidence, right? Things such as in the village, the personification, and then the imagery that we talked about there, and promises to keep, kind of representing obligations at home and being forced to go miles to rest. Miles sort of representing how much work he has to do and how tired he is. So a little bit of symbolism, a little bit of imagery, and the personification kind of go into that interpretation. Interpretation number 2. Some people believe that the speaker in this poem is contemplating suicide. The woods are dark and deep because he finds them lovely, as if they call him into their darkness. In his mind, this is the darkest evening of the year, so it could indicate depression. And yet he has promises to keep. These promises are perhaps to friends or family or other loved ones that cause him to continue his journey in life. He has miles to go before he sleeps. Sleep here could mean death or represent death symbolically, and the speaker realizes his life is not yet meant to end. He has years to go before he can finally find rest. Thus, he leaves the woods and his dark contemplations and returns home. So again, here we have the claim that this is a poem about suicide. We have imagery sort of backing that up, and symbolism as well. So if we're putting it together, which one is correct? Well, really, either interpretation could be correct. The important thing is to remember that you have to develop a claim and consider the literary elements you've discussed. So the claim is your point of view. I don't like using the word argument so much, but a lot of other people will if you take classes with them. So they'll say you're developing a literary argument. So you're developing a literary argument or a claim and showing your point of view about how the poem should be interpreted. That is always going to be the basis of your claim with poetry. What I'd like you to think about doing is how to use those literary elements to support your claim. So for example, you could say Robert Frost uses imagery, personification, and structural repetition in this poem to show that the speaker is contemplating the quiet beauty of nature in comparison to his busy, work-filled life. Or you could say, because of the poet's use of imagery, symbolism, and personification, Frost's poem can be construed as a dreamlike image of someone contemplating suicide or considering his imminent death. Both of those have reasons for the interpretation being correct, based in literary elements. So that's sort of how I would like you to write about these things. Coming up with a claim that shows your point of view on how to interpret them, the poem, and then using the literary elements as reasons for the claim. And then, as I showed you in the last slide, we'll go back for a moment, Having short things from the text. You'll notice the longest one I have here is this. Short quotes from the text as evidence to prove each one of your reasons. That's basically what I'd like you to do, and I hope that we're going to do some practice with this and things like discussion boards or journals, and then we'll put it all together for your final project. So that's it, and I look forward to reading your interpretations and your responses to the poems that we're going to be looking at. Thanks!